Welcome to the Integral Stage. In this Mindwalk episode, Layman, Pascal, and I will follow up on our time mindfulness discussion with a reflection on space. Like time, space is usually just a given in our lives, a ubiquitous feature of our world that we take for granted, unless at times we don't have enough of it, or sometimes we may feel a vertiginous excess of it. But precisely because it is such a ubiquitous element of our experience, space is fundamentally important. Our relationship to space can influence how we hold and comport ourselves, how we handle pain, how we relate to others, how we navigate our experience, in short, how we constitute self and world. As in the previous discussion of time, Layman and I will start with a somewhat freewheeling discussion of the philosophical, psychological, and spiritual dimensions of space, and then we'll follow this up with a space mindfulness exercise for you to try out on your own. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
This was the opening question I thought of. It goes like this. Bruce, is space a function of energy and information, or do energy and information presuppose a space in which they exist? But then I say, wait, that's too hard a question. How about, Bruce, is space infinite?
Well, I'm happy you toned the question down to something easy and manageable.
Yeah. I brought it back down to impossible.
Yeah.
Unthinkable.
I actually like the first one better.
Okay. Either one.
Yeah. What do you mean by infinite?
That's kind of the whole heart of the question. I mean, I have a personal bias, which is I find time to be thinkably indefinite. I find it impossible to imagine a currently existing infinite amount, and therefore I cannot imagine space as infinite. And I think that something in that area led Einstein to say finite but unbounded in his description of space. If I try to imagine myself going forever, I think that deludes me into imagining space as infinite. But really, I have to tease apart the going from the area in which I'm imagining the travel occurring. I can easily imagine a process without imagining it coming to an end. Infinite time, okay. I can go forever. But is there enough area for me to go forever in? No, I can't grasp a currently completed infinite amount. And therefore, the thinkability of the infinite nature of space never enters my actual thinking. And therefore, I'm highly suspicious of even mathematical models that appear to include an infinite space. I think what's unthinkable to us is unthinkable to us, and we should try to respect that as best we can.
There has been a dance back and forth in conceptions of space, whether we conceive of space as a thing or not a thing. And I think one of the things that you're talking about is it's really hard to imagine space as an infinitely big thing. You know, if we conceive of it as a room or as some kind of like a medium, some kind of like giant spread out ether, it's just really hard to imagine that going on forever or being infinitely big, right? At the same time, if we conceive of it still in thing-like manner as having a limit, then that puts us up against that very old space question that, you know, probably every kid entertains at one point. Well, if space has an end, what's on the other side, right? You know, and that's coming from thinking about space as a thing. And if you don't think about space as a thing, maybe you sidestep that a little bit. But then what is it? You know, if you just say it's mere nothingness, that doesn't seem to be satisfactory either. There seems to be something in space that actually is contactable, that exerts some kinds of limits, even while it also seems to be a potentiator of all kinds of of other things. So yeah, I think that's one of the questions that it puts us up against is, are we conceiving of space as a thing or an object or not?
Yeah, I think you're right to bring that up, because the corollary to we can't imagine a currently existing infinite volume is the fact that we also can't imagine a space in addition to space, right? And the kid's question of where does it end becomes the adult's question of what's it expanding into if it expands, right? And we go, well, you can't really, it's not, right? If you listen to a physicist, they say actually everything is expanding in its interstices, right? All the spots on the balloon are getting farther apart, but the total size is not the thing that's expanding.
Mm.
But then if there's an expansion without a change of the total amount, if there's a binding condition on the totality, then either expansion doesn't mean what we think it means, or it expands back into itself, which is the only available space, right? There's a guy, Chris Langan, who was the smartest man ever. He has a very interesting model called the cognitive theoretic model of the universe. And for him, he deals in conspansion. It doesn't make sense to say expansion when you're dealing with total space in reality. It only makes sense to say a simultaneous expansion contraction, because into itself is the only possibility that it has of any expansion room. And so in that model, it's almost like you've got a torus with nothing on the outside with the Big Bang at the center. And it's getting continually bigger and ending up back at its starting point. So you end up having to do paradoxical thinking one way or another if you approach the boundary condition of space. Now, it's interesting whether, is it a volume? Is it something more like a principle? Or is it something more like a substance, right? Is that volume entirely permeated by what I might call proto-material? There are arguments that all matter is like made up of patterned ripples or standing waves in an underlying substance. And if we say with Einstein that you can bend it, stretch it, move it around, glom it up in certain areas, then it's much more substance-like than it is a pure principle of locatability. So I don't know. I think you actually have to subdivide the word into completely different terms. Right? When one person's talking about volume, the other person's talking about an underlying proto-material, and a third person's talking about some kind of syntactical availability of interaction between something analogous to locations. They're not on the same playing field in that discussion.
Exactly. I think that's a great point, that space is being used in multiple senses. And, like Whitehead or others challenging the idea that even space is a fundamental thing, that space is derivative concept from connections and relations and things like that. But then it depends on what you're meaning by space. Space as volume seems to be, in a sense, derivative from that, but space as that matrix which affords relationships altogether, then, you almost have to presuppose that.
It's tricky no matter which way you come at it. The volume thing is interesting because it's not out of the question that volume is a privileged definition of space. It's the root of what we've always meant by it. But if dimensions are extremely multifarious in their nature, if a dimension is any variable you need to make a description of something, so there's a potentially limitless number of dimensions depending on what you're trying to describe and how much specificity you want to give, then why are the dimensions we associate with volume at the center of the discussion of space, anciently and even today? Like double D's are very popular, but what about triple D's? Like, why are those three D's the special D's? Is there anything unique about them, or are they just some D's in an unknown number of D's?
Right. Yeah. Is our preference for them an outgrowth of the limitations of our own condition and our own way that we organize and interact with the world, or is it constitutive of of our being and the way that we are able to perceive? I think, yeah, it's a tough one to get around.
I can't think of a thing without essentially thinking of it as three-dimensional in space, whatever the time aspect is. So I feel like I have to honor that limitation of my thought capacity that I share with my fellow human beings. But at the same time, I'm really open to these arguments out of quantum mechanics that proximity has a meaning more closely related to entanglement, right? That what I experience as space is a surface effect. That what looks close to me or far away to both my perceptual senses and my technological measurement machines is different than what's actually close and far away, right? That if you entangle two electrons and move them far apart, as far as I can tell, they're actually really close together, which is why they can exchange something. It looks to me like they're circumventing the speed of light limitations on the space-time universe, but they're not if they're actually much closer than I think they are. It's a kind of perceptual illusion that applies also to our equations and machinery. That would be weird, but something has to explain those apparent proximity effects that we now have demonstrated in our physics.
Exactly, yeah. That's part of what I was getting at is our own embodied cognition as being organisms navigating a world. It seems natural to us to, as a shorthand, assume simple location of objects, that this object occupies a very definite region of space and it's delimited and it's really only there. And then there's this other object that's here. And that's a good shorthand for basically describing our ordinary reactions that don't require a lot more discriminations or in-depth conceptualization of what's going on there. Whereas, Whitehead and others challenge the idea of simple location. And part of that relates, I think, to this entanglement that things, simple location assumes that everything exists unto itself within its own bounded region and would be there independent of all relationship to anything else. And that's questionable. Especially, we've been able to demonstrate that with our experiments in quantum mechanics and the laboratory fact of entanglement of objects or electrons or other elemental pieces of matter with each other. So it depends really on possibly the type of space again that you're talking about, and that's maybe a direction I'd like to to look in or lean us towards is these reflections on space, especially if we're interested in cultivating space mindfulness, right? To go along with our earlier theme on time mindfulness. Besides possible, technological advances or advantages we might have by achieving a more sophisticated physical understanding of space, if we could have warp drives or who knows what else could be possible. But practically in an everyday way, what is the benefit to us of thinking about the nature of space and questioning the ordinary presuppositions that we hold about space as maybe a large container for independently existing objects? What happens when we really begin to engage with those questions at the level of lived relevance?
I think there are ways to leverage a classical notion of space that are good for us, and ways to leverage this more sophisticated contemporary inkling of space that we have for the same purpose. I think that it behooves us, gives us wiggle room to think that where things are might not be exactly where they are. That's really useful, gives us room to move. But personally, what I don't want to do in allowing that in is to become incontinent, to throw off all boundaries, right? You go, because things can be entangled at different locations. Therefore, location is meaningless. Everything is omnipresent. Everything might as well be everywhere. That's not totally unfounded, but it's a dangerous route to go in your thinking, because you lose the rigor and the precision that come with trying to hold a careful balance. Mm-hmm. So I think it is important to try to maintain the idea that there is a limiting condition in space, even though space has traditionally been used as a metaphorical image to inculcate a feeling of unlimited expansion in spiritual practitioners. For me, this is a recurrent issue, is the difference between space and spaciousness. Right, the qualitative experience of spaciousness, which I think people helpfully encourage in each other and themselves by combining the notion of release with the notion of a vast space to produce spaciousness. I think that's very useful, but most of the statements about it are, to my mind, propositionally untrue. Right? You don't ever encounter an infinite space, and you're not really focusing on volume or space or even emptiness or nothingness in those exercises. That can be very misleading. What you're trying to do is to be unbound in yourself and with the objects of your cognition. So I think that the real utility, the most basic utility from one point of view is expansiveness. That spaciousness and space as a pointer at spaciousness reminds us to decontract, which is its major advantage.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And there are, I think, some traps that people get into spiritually when they lead or lean too much in the direction of this diffusion. And they lose focus, and they lose I think discrimination and other things. I think thinking about space in terms of the dimensionality of space, the limits of space, maybe the types of spaces that there are, there's a close relationship between how we inhabit our bodies and how we conceive of ourselves in relationship to the kind of spatial models we hold. So I think there's the value of spaciousness in opening us up towards release from tension and things like that we can. I'd like to talk about that some, because I think there is usefulness there, and it's part of a space mindfulness. But I also think the very fundamental ways that we conceive of space are deep presuppositions about space and our inhabitation of space and what limits it sets and what possibilities it affords, plays a constitutive role in how we construct self and self-world and self-other relationships or object relationships or formations. So I think that's another important thing to look at, in that maybe the shift towards a more advanced or sophisticated model of space can be accompanied by a move towards subtler forms of embodiment that don't necessarily represent the loss of focus or diffusion that we were worried about and concerned about there.
Yeah, I don't think it's coincidence that we use the term positioning to mean space, but also the comportment, attitude, and perspective that we have upon the world that we inhabit. There's a great book called Spacious Body by Jeffrey Maitland. He was a Zen practitioner and a student of Adi Da, and was the senior Rolfer structural integrationist in their organization. So he's very focused on decontracting the body. But his main point, his definition of freedom in that book, is the creative appropriation of limitation. Right? So there's a sense of accepting and taking possession of the limitation factor in order to give yourself the decontraction. And one of the problematic aspects of the mysticism that wants to go to total expansion, or think of an absolute emptiness, or feel that we're utterly unbound, or that quantum physics gives you permission to pretend you're absolutely free of space and time, is that it doesn't take the limitation conditions seriously enough in order to actually turn them into a full freedom. And so I think that even the kind of logical boundaries that I was initially talking about what we can think and what we can't think, which are to some degree rooted in our bodily experience, it's important to accept and try to enter into the limiting condition and set that free rather than to reject all limitations as if that was the route to freedom.
Yeah, jumping ahead a little bit, possibly, there's a way to see all limiting conditions as themselves space. We're used to contrasting object and space or boundary and space. But as we, I think, know from, both experiential or yogic practice, but also, if we're accomplished in analyses of different kinds, the closer you draw to a boundary or to a limit condition, often the more you become enabled to discover a new kind of space.
Yeah, without getting too much into my adjacency ideas, in which there is no location, there's only proximities. To be somewhere is to self-approximate a position, not to actually be there. I want to touch on this idea of object in space and where it started to enter my thinking as a person. And I mentioned this the other day. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, if I'm remembering this correctly. Kirk is versing Khan. Khan is a eugenically engineered superhuman with massive military intelligence. They're inside a nebulous cloud in space. But Kirk intuitively realizes that Khan is playing on a two-dimensional battlefield because he's used to wars taking place on the surface of a planet. So Kirk realizes he can go down and come up behind him and destroy him, which is a great move. And when I was a kid, to me, that meant there was a connection between genius, intuition, and realizing the significance of this third dimensional vector. And I thought about it a lot as a kid, and it seemed to me that mostly we look at two-dimensional surfaces and we think about them. And it's like the thinking takes the place of the third dimension. We don't really see space very well. And when I would practice as an early form of meditation, trying to observe the volume that made up every structure, my ability to think about the structures consciously vanished. So it was like I gave the third dimension back to the things I was looking at, and they seemed more useful, right? I was like a little kid in the sense that I was reminded of how I could get up on things. I was reminded to look up at ceilings, that kind of stuff. I was open to a new realm, a new set of possible action affordances through my recollection of the intensity of the third dimension, rather than just a nominal acknowledgement of spatialized objects. So from that point of view, every object, I'm just imagining it as full of space to the point of being entirely space, rather than as an object within a space. Everything becomes as if transparent. So that one, I liked that one a lot. It was useful to me as a kid.
Yeah, I think that's actually really important insight, and a number of therapeutic methods now actually work with that, like the open focus method and the TSK tradition I talked about in the last video. That is, exercises like that are a way to approach what they would consider second order space, beginning to see space in a deeper way than our ordinary object and empty, volumetric container perspective. So that's like the way to begin to like move towards the next, what they would call the second level. In the last video, I wanted to bring up a quote by Tartong Tulku, which was, somebody was talking back, a couple decades ago about being here now, be here now as the great spiritual injunction. And he said, that's a great idea, except most people don't know what is meant by be or here or now. Yeah, and I think in a way, what you were just talking about in terms of exploring your way of exploring, how you held objects and how you practiced experientially accessing, you could say, third dimensionality, to feel space as volume and the effects of that, that actually begins to, I think, shift. If you begin to dissolve boundaries in that sense, I'm imagining there was an impact on your own ways of inhabiting your being in relationship to other things.
Yes, I think it had two parts. I think at first, it afforded me a larger range of immediate options about how to relate my body to physical objects, how to move them around or move myself around them, which was useful. Like your kid, we would play war, that kind of stuff. Right? Not every kid playing war goes up a tree, so to speak. So you've got this range of flexible options, which is really good. But if you keep looking into that, you get this sense of your own object in space and the reticence at the edges of your own object where you have pulled back a little bit. And that observation that you might be contracting from the full volume that you could occupy in relation to other volumes leads to a whole set of insights about releasing yourself in relational space, right? Fully feeling the hammer, fully eating the peach, fully embracing the other person, that kind of stuff. Because there is a spatial aspect to both real relating and to subtle obstructions in our process of relating to each other.
I think one thing that we can look at with that, and I don't know, I was thinking of bringing this in a little bit later, but it really fits here, is actually the effects of trauma on the body. And when we have injuries, when we have traumatic experiences, we usually have one or more adaptive strategies around that. One is to focus outward on objects and kind of direct attention away from you. You don't want to keep focusing on yourself as victim, and so you focus out on objects, and you have a scattered or an outward kind of attention. Other people feeling maybe greatly impinged on by experience and relationships withdraw into their core and establish certain sets of boundaries and put other objects and people at a safe distance, right? So we interfere, I think, when you were experimenting as a child and experiencing space within objects in a way that allowed you to kind of dissolve boundaries. I think there is that's a level of access or a level of experience that any of us can tap, where we can feel our spatial interpenetration with other beings and other objects. The more that you contact your own sense of interior space, the more you begin practicing actually feeling space inside and outside. There's a deep sense of intimacy that can grow, and you can actually feel a spatial participation with other things around you. But most of us, I think, through our object relational self-formation, we actually cut off that mode of experiencing space. I think actually it's probably fairly elemental to us, and our defendedness, our trauma leads us to maybe firm up boundaries and cut off that primordial experience of space connection between things. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Well, I don't know if this is just a personal thing or whether it's more general, but my experience has always been that the shift of my feeling attention toward the total somatic interior space of the body was the fastest and most reliable way to feel the enlivenment or the vital energy, whether real or metaphorical, of the system, so that I was available to flows of stimulation in my organism and able to decontract, to unpack the organism a little bit better. And because I was tracking those flows of stimulation made available through an enhanced proprioceptive inner spaciousness, I was also then able to watch them go past me, right? You touch a leaf or you do chi healing or whatever it is, you're watching those flows move past your boundary, and then you're letting yourself out toward the spaciousness of the other as well, and also assuming that they have a somatic interiority in which these flows are occurring. And I think if your nervous system can't tune itself to that somatic proprioceptive interiority, it's considerably less likely that you're going to be able to feel the full range of stimulation effects in yourself or appreciate them in other organisms and other people.
I think psychotherapeutically, or maybe psychoanalytically, we've discovered certain defensive structures of the personality go together with certain modes of attention. And two examples at the opposite extremes, somebody with obsessive compulsive personality disorder tends to have a laser focus. They're very good at noticing objects in great detail. They're very good at noticing fine detail. They're very good at noticing very subtle changes in the arrangements of things. They're very good at noticing imbalances or disharmonies among the arrangements of things. There's a really sharp, clear laser focus, but it's also a kind of defendedness. It's a kind of defendedness against a deep participation in your own flows of energy within. It's not safe to feel those things. It's not safe to feel the unbridled flow of energy within yourself, because you don't know what's going to leak out and you don't know what's going to be punished. I mean, if you want to think about, very early childhood formation, if you begin to have libidinal impulses or difficulty with potty training or whatever else is going on, you learn to be pretty defended because you don't know what's going to come at you from outside. So you develop a laser focused attention to make sure you keep track of all details and keep them in an order that's manageable. Conversely, you may have somebody who is exploited in a way, inappropriately in a way, by their parents, made into an object in a way that turns them into a story that is totally ungrounded in their own reality. The parent projecting fantasies on the child in a way that, especially sexualized fantasies, but others too, that can lead to histrionic personality disorder. And the attentional pattern among histrionics tends to be a very, very diffuse attention that's not good at focusing on detail. That is very, very big picture, but also very almost cartoon-like, impressionistic patterning, or they'll capture the big salient features, but they don't notice the details, and it doesn't go very deep. And they like to play on the expanded surface of things. That histrionic pointing to dramatization, to making things bigger than they are, again, as a flight from actually feeling what's maybe uncomfortable in the moment, in terms of your own interiority, right? So it may feel like we're going far astray from talk about space mindfulness, but to me, these are modes of enacting space or creating spatial environments that are rooted in our woundedness, that I think are relevant.
There's certainly a long history of people associating contraction, right, spatially with the root of most psychological disorders, right? A perfect example of that is Wilhelm Reich, where he thought of what he called sympathetic atonia, right? Chronic contraction. You've pulled in the system. You're not letting it actually function. And the psychological correlate of that are a set of predictable disturbances, of which schizophrenia, neurosis, and sociopathy, right? He wasn't exactly correct about all those things. It was early 20th century stuff. But the general principle was feeling, even physically, has been contracted. And we're stuck in these patterns of unconscious chronic contraction. And like you say, there is a pattern of attention involved in each of those things. I think the main thing about those patterns is they all involve a fixation, right? Even if it looks like you're fixating on the big picture, you're still actually narrowly focusing on the big picture. And I think the omnidirectional possibilities of your awareness, which include the fluid capacity to shift between these modes, that's unavailable to you as a result of the contraction. And it's like squeezing something and it just shoots out one end. And that one end could shoot out at a narrow target, or it could shoot out diffusely at a big target, but nonetheless, it may be the side effect of spatial contraction in the being as a whole. There's a lot of arguments to that effect. So I think there is an interesting correlation between psychopathology and the way we inhabit ourselves spatially. But it's important not to just look at all of those things as pathological in an integral sense, because some of them are evidence of simpler developmental capacities, right? And we have this idea of these levels of unfolding complexity as increasing expansiveness, increasing inclusion. So those are spatial metaphors. And there's healthy versions of smaller, simpler ways of living, of the tribe, of the little ego, of the person who doesn't have a great richness of mind and heart. So there's very normal, natural ways to inhabit smaller spaces. But if you're actually adapted to a larger space and you inhabit a smaller space, then that's a regressive contraction and you have some kind of pathology that goes with it. And I think one of the interesting things about that dichotomy is when you look cross-culturally, you see people have different senses of personal space, right? And so the question becomes, from the Western point of view, if you look at a mass culture in the East and people seem more comfortable having very little personal space, is that natural? Are they just freely inhabiting a spatial range that looks smaller to us? Or is it the correlate of Oriental despotism, right? Is it a function of mass culture keeping people in place by arranging society such that individuals do not have the spatial freedom to unfold their possibilities and perhaps start thinking in ways that are in opposition to or undermining the state in which they exist?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And one of the things that you had said earlier on in our talk about your caution around the use of space in spiritual techniques to lead people to just think about big infinite expanses and get lost in this sense of boundarylessness. I think that, and that it's important to be aware of limitations and to be able to come back to the narrower focus. I think that relates to kind of what we were just talking about now, in the fact that what is, you could say, wrong in the personality disorders I was talking about has to do with a fixation, an inability to move between modes, that these are all developmentally appropriate and situationally useful modes. But the problem comes in if we get fixated in one area or another, and we're not able to kind of maybe shift into the modes that are most useful and beneficial for us in different contexts, because we're stuck in a certain attentional pattern, in a certain enacted spatial regime, self-world regime. And I think you're right to point out that culturally this may manifest in different ways in different societies. I'm kind of a fan of Sloterdijk's work, and his spherology work, his trilogy of bubbles, globes, and foams really explores developmentally the enactment of these different types of spaces, both individually, interpersonally, and socially, looking at what does it mean as we've moved towards globalization, what kind of spatial arrangement is there, meaning what kind of self-other patterning, what pattern of projection is happening, in those different historical contexts and social contexts. We could get into it or not, but I think he has a pretty fascinating excavation of and kind of analysis of the development of the human being and the development of human culture through the metaphor, or maybe more than metaphor, of spatial regimes and the kind of spatial regimes that we inhabit from the womb all the way up to empire.
All right, well, give us some of the highlights.
Well, in Bubbles, what he's looking at is he wants to think of the self always at least as dyadic, that if there's a space, it's always a relationship. And so for him, even the infant developing in the womb is already in relationship in a couple ways. It's in relationship to the placenta, which is feeding it and facing it. It's also in relationship to the sonority of the mother's voice and the patterns of her body very early on. So it's already forming in a kind of relational context. And so the very initial bubble of the uterus or the infant self after it's born is a dyadic or a relational field. And a lot of other things grow out of that. He talks about, kind of developmentally cordiality or intercordiality of how, as we moved towards, medieval culture, for instance, there was a lot of metaphor being used of people's hearts being connected and sharing blood and things like that. But really talk about the kind of self that was formed in those contexts.
Does Sloterdijk discuss something like a healthy, unhealthy dialectic within each of those, or not?
Not exactly. Yes, to a degree, but not exactly. He doesn't go systematically through each stage and talk about healthy and unhealthy expressions at each level of development. But he does try to trace out the overall trajectory of human psychological development, especially in the West, and to look at both the strengths that were present, the gifts of insight that were present at each stage of the self's unfolding and the spatial regime that it enacted and was sustained by, and also the limitations that ultimately prompt growth towards new modes of spatial enactment, new modes of self and world enactment. Generally, he traces a line from a grosser to a subtler conception of space and also of self and other. When I was speaking just a minute ago about intercordiality and the interconnection of the heart and the sharing of the blood that sometimes showed up in medieval art, that's a grosser form of the intersubjectivity that Sloterdijk wants to say runs basically through all of our development, that at each stage the self is an intersubjective being, and that particular image of the sharing of the blood and such was a way of visualizing and beginning to hold the sense of the self as intersubjective, as co-participant with others. And that move towards subtler articulations and expressions, say, in the scholastic notion of the circumcision of the Trinity. And that's actually a horizon of the self that even most people in modern culture haven't moved towards or found a way to embody yet. But that's an interesting insight that he has, is that there's a dance between the human self-conception and the God conception. And the earlier, I think it parallels a little bit some of Gebser's insights, but the earlier human being is a subject facing a God, facing the icon. And he sees the emergence of the individual self as the introjection of the God concept. There was a Greek idea and an early Christian idea of God as basically a being whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere, whose boundary cannot be found. And Sloterdijk suggests that there's this introjection of that God's concept into the individual, and that actually births the sense of being an individual, being somebody whose center can be anywhere and whose boundary, whose periphery is unfindable. So there's that development, which now he would say is inadequate to the degree that it leads to the sense of the self as this unitary, singular one inside of the bubble of the world. And so he's wanting to reclaim, again, this sense of intersubjectivity. But parallel to that, in terms of just thinking about like the limitations that he points out, the failures of some of the spatial regimes, he looks at how there was this movement towards global empire. And that moved under the spatial metaphor of the globe, of the containing womb, of the uterus, that we were going to basically unify all of the world under the, within the sphere of this culture's empire. And that failed, that failed multiple times. And he would say that this whole spatial regime that was being enacted, this sense of there being a single global encompassing womb, this kind of inclusivism, was not sophisticated or subtle enough to sustain or manage all of that complexity and all of that diversity, and those global projects failed, and that we're on the cusp of something else now, where we need to move towards what he calls a foamy structure, and he talks about the more complex and subtle forms of deep co-participation, like Trinitarian models, though he's never really very theological, but he'll borrow some theological concepts. So it's pretty complex, and there's a lot to go into. Maybe what do you think about that at this point, and then we can go on.
I think that, first of all, sounds like a pretty reasonable look at a slice of the way we migrate from amber to orange, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. That some of the overwhelming concepts within the traditional mode of describing reality suggest to us interior functions that, if we actually deal with them, help us mutate into a higher grade individual who has some of those capacities, right? Even the the kind of satanic romance thing of the Enlightenment involves the idea that the individual is going to take on some of the qualities traditionally ascribed to the divine. He's going to be reason. He's going to be the knower. He's going to be potentially infinite in expanse and mobile in his center. He's going to maybe even make his way to the top of the pyramid where the glowing eye used to be. So I think there's something to be said for that spatial aspect of that transformation, and that there's a shift from the eye of God to the eye of the painter who beholds the perspectively oriented painting. I also think there's some real biological factors to what's healthy or unhealthy in each of these zones, because there are studies on rats, which rats are pretty well behaved with each other as long as they smell right. But if you put more than a certain number of rats in a certain area, they turn on each other like crazy, right? Rape and murder proliferate in rat society just due to population density.
Right.
And that's reasonable, given resource constraints under those conditions, but it should tell us something about ourselves, that regardless of the stage you're at, and regardless of the cultural context you're in, there are certain biologically evolved constraints on the amount of space you need in order to function and flourish in an okay manner. And if you don't have that much space, you start to lose it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I saw there's a paper a few years ago talking about that study that they did with, increasing the number of rats and how they began to turn on each other. It's interesting to look at then, high density populations where that happens, and high density populations where that seems to be controlled or mediated, like in Japan, for instance. In Sloterdijk's discussion, one of the things he talks about is the space of interfaciality, and that he considers the human world to be constituted by at least 9 essential types of spaces that all interact with each other. And he has different names for them. There's the chirotop, which is the hand enacted space. There's the thermotop, which is where we gather in warmth together. There's the uterotop and the efforts that we make to basically extend the protections of the uterus out to greater and greater protective insulated immunological zones or spaces. And so he has a whole, metaphoric play of different kinds of spaces that we enact. But one that he talks about is, especially generative, especially for the human being, is what he calls the space of interfaciality. And he says that actually the shape of our face has grown in the mutual gaze of our particular primate species, that we have actually formed our own biological structure, and the flower of our face has grown in the hothouse of the interfacial gaze. And he says, if you look at other primates, they do not stare eye to eye. They do not look into each other's faces, but we do. And he thinks that gazing eye to eye and face to face is one of the contexts that has called forth the unique shape and character of the human being. It's established a certain kind of space that allows for, possibly in that relationality, also a stronger formation of a sense of a secure self.
It certainly calls into question the custom of having certain people visually concealed and facially concealed, right? There may be an argument from that point of view that certain customs lean toward the pathological, regardless of their cultural anchoring. One of the things when we were talking about trauma and psychopathology that is still on my mind is this twin aspect of spacing out, that we tend to blank out under overload conditions. So you could say that someone is spaced out in a negative way where their cognitive capacities are just non-present. They themselves appear to have vacated the position or the spatiality of their system. On the other hand, spacing out has a very positive sense, right? Spacing out is one of the things you do in trance. It's one of the things you do in ritual, where you find openings, you find those gaps between the moments of your thought, you pass through them, there's an expansive outward falling into a spaciousness in which you are more like floating than standing. So there's a beautiful advanced form of being spaced out and a negative self-destructive or defensive disposition of being spaced out. And I think that's true not just in regular human affairs, but in the way that we've talked about the mystical and spiritual arts down through history. So Lord Whitesnake, who other people persist in calling Sri Nagarjuna for some reason, right, he introduced this shunya and shunyata concept, which it always bugs me was later translated as more or less emptiness by the Tibetans. So there's a wonderful thing there. There's something beautiful about that spaced out spaciousness he's describing, but it's right next to an interpretation where you're fixated on the empty quality of the infinite volume. And to me, I know you might like a word like openness or something like that for shunya. I like indiscernibility because I feel like it's describing where you reach for something and you pass right through it, where you expect there to be a boundary and the boundary's given way. So there's this quality of what it's like to move through spaciousness versus this quality of telling yourself that you're staring at the empty void, and that these two have very different long-term effects in terms of the liveliness of our being, I think.
In some of Wilber's old transpersonal books, I believe he called the pathological version of that the Arhat's sickness, of being focused in a way on the emptiness, on the voidness, on the infinite nothing, that while it has, you could say, maybe certain insulating effects from for you as an individual against feeling certain kinds of suffering or whatever, ultimately doesn't really serve the individual well to interface with the world. And I was thinking too about, that space, the spaced outness, and the spaciousness, as two different sides of really the same thing. And I mentioned earlier the open focus technique, and I was thinking about some of the things that you were mentioning earlier, and in terms of your own experience with that. They've found, through biofeedback and through other mechanisms of tracing what happens for people, when you actually put yourself in touch experientially with feeling the spaciousness in your body, the spaciousness in the room, the spaciousness that is within every object. The more that you actually practice experiencing that, it actually puts the brain in a synchronous alpha state, and it leads to deep relaxation throughout the body, reorganization of the tissues and structures. It actually helps release pain, and it actually increases coherence and synchrony of the different parts of the body and brain. So there's all these beneficial aspects of that, which are quite different from the diffuseness of somebody who's just spaced out and not thinking about things, or lost in a vague expanse, or in the scattered, larger than life, unfocused attentional pattern of the histrionic. So I think we need to, make those distinctions.
There's a significant distinction to be made there, for sure. I think it's very natural for human beings to reach for the metaphor of space in order to describe some of these phenomenon, right? That, like you say, observing the volume of things can bring these brain changes about, just like looking into the starry womb of the night sky, or even watching really good science fiction where things are just going in space. It has this effect that's very similar to the positive balancing effects of certain meditations. And those are often the meditations where you feel benevolently spaced out. I'm fond of thinking about my balanced brain as achieving a kind of coherent field, the subjective effect of which appears to be an expansion and liftoff in a very pleasant way. That's what I associate with shunya. But it's full of that. It's not an emptiness. Now, there may be ways to get that same effect, and I think a lot of people probably do get a similar effect through their contemplations of what nothingness or emptiness or just space are. But there's definitely a risk there. And I think the risk comes when you transition from the experience to the philosophy, right? The idea that of what emptiness means to your mind and brain and body, and the states you can get into and the usefulness of those states, versus asserting that the world is ultimately empty, right? Its effect on you is one thing, and your assertion that it is the fact of the world is quite another, in my view. And I think the danger is it's just dogmatic to say that this is all empty. But when I experience the emptiness of what I previously thought was solid, then I'm not only expanded and weightless, I'm also balanced and coordinated in new ways. So I think we've naturally, historically reached for the metaphor of space to help us get that effect.
There are some practices I'm thinking of from Native American traditions that maybe they play with space in a way, but they also keep you here on Earth. They don't lose you, in a sense, in that metaphysical space. I'm thinking of an example of a medicine woman named Walking Thunder. She's a musing teacher, and her name is Walking Thunder because she has huge bellowing laughter. But she talks about when she
I
was.
thought you were going to say thighs.
She does too. Yeah, actually. She's the first to admit that. She did a deep meditation and was the first thing that she said to the shaman who was doing it for her is, "My God, how fat am I?" Because she was exploring the interior of her body. But she recalls the time when she was a child and her grandfather used to come and visit them. The Navajo have this idea that children are nourished if they go outside and witness the sunrise. That's the first thing that any child should do, is experience the sunrise. And there's a certain kind of nourishment and energy that they take from that vitalizes them and awakens creative energies for them. And that should come before food or anything else, is to go out and be in the sunrise. And so she used to go out and do that, and her grandfather would show up every now and then. And one of the times the grandfather told her and her sister, "I want you to both drink this water, but don't swallow it. Hold it in your mouth. And I'm going to, measure, how much I poured into your mouth. And now I want you to run over to that arroyo and then come back and spit it back into the cup." And so they would practice that. And she said that, when she got back, she tried to hawk up a loogie to make sure that that all the water was retained. But the lesson of that, because usually they would find that some water was swallowed, and they used to repeatedly practice that. But the lesson of that was, her grandfather would say, when you are aware of the four mountains, which actually happen to lie in the four directions, when you don't lose your awareness of the four mountains at any time, you will not lose that water. And so he was trying to practice them and get them to practice an embodied spatial awareness, which would lead to an internal balance and harmony for them, a groundedness, a rootedness, but also an interior balance and well-being. So yeah, they used to practice with that until they wouldn't swallow anything.
Sounds like they're practicing for a challenge on Survivor.
Exactly.
It's interesting, the idea, when you mentioned this woman, the idea of big people, right? And the feeling of having more space, regardless of whatever your particular health thing is, a sense of the size and the vastness of individuals. And they own that beautiful thing that larger people have when they actually inhabit how large they are, but also that all of us have when you let your heart be as big as it is and let your belly be as full as it is, that kind of stuff. So there's a beautiful element to spatialization in all of that. But I really like, as you were saying, that classic indigenous model of kind of using compass directions in a way to orient your body in its self-awareness, and to have that be the first stone on which your tower of self-awareness is going to be built. And, classic, when I was a kid, we watched ninja movies, and the best was always a blind guy who had to fight. Blind Fury, Rutger Hauer, right? The idea of the blind fighter, or of the person who has to balance on the pole, it's very similar to being in the midst of those four mountains. You have to physically comport yourself in a way that is analogous to self-awareness. But there's a thing that just occurred to me while you were saying all that, which is there's two ways to think of space in terms of states, in the integral sense of states. One is we view all the states as being on a continuum, and space applies mostly, as we normally think, to material. There's physical space, and then our gross mind is one step removed, and it makes a map based on physical reality in which to organize its gross experience. So it has a spatialized neural map. And then you get subtler and subtler, and you get farther and farther away from space. You don't need it as much in the subtle realm. You don't need it at all in the causal realm, and it makes no sense at all in the non-dual realm. So that's the states on a continuum where space is anchored to the physical universe. But if we don't take that continuum model, if all four of these basic states are always present and come up together, they're not on a continuum, then is there something like space in all of them? So, what's your feedback on that? Obviously, the gross realm has something like space. Is there space in dreams? Is there space in witnessing? Is there space in syntax? Is there space in math? Does non-duality have space? Does that even make sense? Is there space in all the states or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually thinking of looking at that also in terms of, is there a space for thought? Is there a space for feeling and imagination? Is there a space for the dream realm or causally? And of course, sometimes people identify the causal with space in a sense, in terms of it being this experientially, this voidness or this gap. Um, I think it's a great question to ask. I think obviously at the gross level, when we're talking about the appearance of distance between, there's an object here, there's an object there, we're all occupying what you could call metric space. That's the gross level version of space. It does seem to be that, when you're dreaming, there needs to be a space in which the whole play appears. But when you actually talk about distance between, it's obvious that that's much more relative and constructed. It's easier to feel how that's a construction in the dream space. So things are, in my sense of it, more transparent. There's more of a sense of it being a creative play rather than something that we can grossly actually interact with, because you can find in the dream state space collapsing and expanding in ways that are impossible at the gross realm. So there's a sense of it being more enacted. The causal, at least if you're talking about the causal as maybe what the Tibetans call hedawa, which is that gap between thoughts, or the gap that fills the mind when you sneeze or have an orgasm, or also when you enter deep arupa jhanas, some of the deeper formless realms, where there's this experience of immersion in formlessness. There's that sense that there's something fundamental about that, and it feels like a subtler kind of space. It doesn't feel like a space that you can talk about distance between anymore, but there's a sense of it almost as an infinite allowingness. And I think then, especially if you take non-dual in the way that Wilbur likes to frame it, which is the non-dual is the experience of the inseparability of the gross, the subtle, and the causal. And there also seems to be that, in one sense, that that deep, subtle space, that super subtle or extra subtle space that you contact in the causal, is no different from the solidity of the cup that's right in front of you on the table. That you experience those things as inseparable.
Yeah, the non-dual is a tricky one, where you end up having to say there is and isn't for everything, right? There's a Zen parable where it's something to the effect that the whole universe is 3 feet wide. Something.
Yeah, right.
But exactly 3 feet wide. For the other ones, I tend to think there is something analogous to space. The subtle seems to me to do things that are extremely tricky in normal material space, but not impossible. Right? I know that if you were to draw a picture in paint on the surface of water, it would change and flip and pass into each other, but that doesn't cease to obey ordinary metrics in a way. It's just a much more complicated,
more fluid
version. Yeah. So, and I think, in dreams, you not only have the sense of a domain, you have a sense of travel, and you have very often the sense of going to a place in the dream space that you've been to before only in the dream space. So there's a sense of location, a sense of travel, and a sense of a realm. Those are all pretty strong spatial indicators. And I don't think there's any special reason to think that there isn't even a computable metric of the subtle realm, even if we're light years from being able to instantiate that. The causal, I treat in a very broad sense. I think of it as pure form. I think of formlessness as one example of a statement of pure form, right? Formlessness is a transparent assertion of a boundary condition of cognition, as is the self of the self, or the isness of anything, or any logical or mathematical statement, right? So I feel like it's not just space-like gaps, say, between your thoughts. When you encounter that, there's some perfect suspension of the normal, subtle, and gross conditions that bind cognition. But if you're paying attention, that also happens when you think about how well 2 and 2 add up to be 4, which is absolutely well. So to me, the syntactical domain covers logic and mathematics and causal mysticism all together. And there's something like different distances in that space, right? Our entire n-dimensional mathematical rubric is based on the fact that 5 is farther away from 1 than 2 is. When we reach for the term farther away, I don't think inanely. There is some kind of analogous intensifying or de-intensifying of the relationship between perspectival structures, algorithms, pure quantities, pure logical realities. And I think even the eye of the eye either is something you access through a loop, which implies a space, or you say, well, no, it doesn't move away from where it exactly always already is at the pure infinite spot that's so infinitesimally infinite, it's almost not a spot, but it still kind of is. It's right. It's my ultimate empty perspectival affordance, but I still can't think about that in object terms without using space to do so. So for me, I can see a way for all of them to have it, except the one where you have to say it does and it doesn't.
Yeah, I don't know if this would align with what your own intuition of it, but in TSK, they would talk about, you could consider it possibly a causal level of understanding of space, is that distance between is actually just the timing out of differences at the same spot. There's like the appearance of an actual space to travel is just the timing out of differences that's happening at the same infinitesimal spot.
That sounds like it accords pretty nicely with a lot of advanced models of physics, but it's right on the edge of being a useful thought or not.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, one of the ways that they turn that towards, I would say, usefulness is in terms of just, a pragmatic reminder that an infinity of straying nevertheless leaves us always at home.
There are some tremendous consolations in the idea of space as the propagation of differences, such that people who I need to have near me who are far away may nonetheless propagate themselves as a difference into my experience and therefore be as if they are with me.
Right.
So I certainly like that aspect, and it plays into ideas like morphogenetic field theory, which, whatever turns out to be the case with that, Sheldrake's version of it has variations on the propagation of differences, such that the patterns move at different speeds in different areas. Right? It might go everywhere in England or everywhere to one half of the planet at a different rate than the other. So that's very interesting as well, because there is this tendency, like we were saying earlier, if you unbind the normal mechanical view of space, It's very easy to go, well, everything can be instantly everywhere all the time, which is not totally untrue, but doesn't get us very far. In reality, anything could be somewhere else at some time that doesn't seem normal to you.
Mm-hmm.
And that skirts that edge between a totally dialed out expansiveness and the contractiveness we associate with mechanistic thinking.
Right, right. Yeah, there was a metaphor that was coming to me. I don't know if it really, I'm just playing with it. If it's good for you looking at the differences in kinds of space, if we're looking at gross and subtle and other kinds of space, but there's the metaphor of the TARDIS from Doctor Who. And it's the object that's bigger on the inside than the outside, right? So I think there's a sense that we have that any individual is bigger on the inside than the outside. I mean, physically, it's true that, you know, if you actually unwound all your veins, they would wrap around the earth a couple times or whatever. But also, I think if you're looking at it in terms of our access to subtle space, there's this sense that we do contain something much larger than our 6 feet or our 3 feet or the thumb-sized dot at the center of the heart that they talk about in Bohm.
That's a very difficult one because there's such a pleasing sense of Escher-like paradox in contemplating those things that one almost gets carried away and wants to affirm them.
Yeah.
I think a lot of apparent paradoxes are when you set two things that aren't from the same reference frame equal to each other, and it blows your mind because it can't be.
Right.
So are inner and outer space in the same context enough to be compared to each other, right? Is it possible to say one is larger than the other? Or are they so different that that's a nonsensical statement? Or could I have a vast infinity of inner space, but it only takes up 6 feet of physical space? Right. I don't know. I don't know if inner space can be bigger than external space or vice versa. They seem very different.
Yeah, no, I think it actually is playing with that or conflating those things. Experientially, it's the case, you know, that we can feel that we can go miles and miles within ourselves, and we can accommodate, you know, in the space of a 20-minute dream, you know, 40 years of experience, right? You know, on the time dimension, where we know on one level, on one domain, one plane, you know, only 20 minutes has passed. Experientially, something else has passed. And if we're thinking about, you know, the different spaces that are all together, the subtle, the gross, and the causal, there is this layering that's there, or this intersection. I don't think that there's infinite physical volumetric space inside the body, right? So again, yeah, it just depends on is it useful to go that way or not? I mean, it's definitely, I think there are, you know, aspects of it that could be psychologically distracting and not useful, and others that could be encouraging and uplifting. You know, sometimes people in states of confinement really actually thrive by finding that immensity within.
There seem to be two aspects for me to the vastness of inner space. And one is, I think you've been getting at this a little bit, the metaphor of compression that we get from electronic technology, whereby, you know, the geometries of our internal organs contain vastness that would surprise and even intimidate us. And that if you're working in software, generally speaking, space means something like a rate of compression. You can take a ton of stuff and squish it down. If you squish it down, there's a whole bunch more there. Mm-hmm. But then you stand back and say the actual space hasn't changed. Some kind of relation in the space has changed. And that might be functionally good enough to call space in a given instance. But from the philosophical point of view, it's not quite good enough because it still implies the overarching space in which that event occurred.
Right.
And there's something similar too in terms of internal spaciousness, the feeling of being utterly unbound. And I think for me, a good idea that helps explain that is you can revise the furniture in a room such that everyone who comes in will say, wow, it feels more spacious in here.
Mm-hmm.
But the objective size of the room is unchanged. So there's a sense that a better configuration of elements accompanies this sense of unboundedness, which is very similar, I think, to the neuropsychological element. The right kind of configuration of your elements feels like a massive increase in spaciousness with no modification of the objective size.
Yeah, there's a parallel here, I think, to something we were talking about, where it can be useful to play with them and use them together, but also it's not actually philosophically true. But the difference between measurable time and lived time, and there's also this sense of a measurable space and a lived space, and you can vastly increase the sense of the lived space by shifting the arrangements and the relationships between things.
I heard that you can massively increase your sense of lived space by invading Austria. Lebensraum joke. Okay. One of the things I wanted to bring up is the relation of space to the notion of vision logic cognition. Because when you try to look at what's going on in your so-called vision logic space, you get, for me anyway, something like a visual, conceptual, dynamic architectural structure. So you go, oh, I saw someone's talking to you about music, and you're like, oh, great. I saw that same shape when I was having this other conversation about mysticism, and then when I was personally watching some ducks in the backyard. I'm seeing this same moving, complicated shape in the understanding in all these different domains, and right. I realize this shape, this moving architecture, operates in a space of its own, which transcends and undergirds all the domains of understanding. So now I have a meta space with meta objects in them. Mm-hmm. Because I personally experience them quasi-architecturally, not necessarily visually, but often visually, I can't help, therefore, but think of that in a spacious place, mm-hmm. in spatial terms. How do you experience it?
Yeah, very much the same. Yeah, and that's, I think that, sometimes when I've been doing, for instance, intensive meditation retreats or things like that, it changes, modes of expression for me. My thinking changes modes of expression for me, where often my thinking is more verbal. But I've definitely had a number of experiences where whatever I was holding interiorly has shifted into a very clear architecture of multiple elements and relationships that actually have a very distinct pattern, a rhythm to them, a way that they cohere together, that then I can link to many other things in my life in terms of like how I've been relating these ideas together, or, it's the metastructure, right? Yeah, so I also feel like that is a grasp of, again, is it a kind of space? Are we just being metaphorical here? Is it useful to speak about it as space or not? But I think, if we're thinking in Gebserian terms, the whole unfolding of the self is correlated by him to geometric shifts, right? In terms of how we're relating ourselves and relating objects to each other in different kinds of spatial and temporal arrangements. So I think that, moving to that meta level is going towards the aperspectivity that he's talking about, I think.
They're definitely, going back over the things we've been saying, it seems like there's healthier and less healthy ways to embody any given space, cognitively, socially, personally. There are ways in which negative impacts on us and negative habits can be described in terms of how we spatialize, and also the ways in which we release ourselves and grow can be described spatially. Then fundamentally, there's this double set of difficulties. The one difficulty is it possible for space to be the effect of something else? Even if we call that more primal thing a primal space, or does what we mean by space have to be presupposed by anything we think of? And then the other side of it is very similar. Is space volume? Is space like a material, as it is in the Einsteinian model? It's deformable like a material. Or is space the availability of interaction? Right? And that's a very pertinent thing metaphorically, but it could also be actual, right? That could be the fundamental level, the code level. And I think that's relevant to all higher studies, right? In physics, we might say, how are the many worlds, if we go with that interpretation, related to each other? Is there an interworld space? Does that make any sense? There has to be some kind of interactability.
Yeah.
And likewise in integral meta theory, right? What's the relationship between perspectives or between types of perspectives that we put on our charts? Is that space-like at all? Are we merely dupes of the fact that there's a literal space between them when we draw them on a piece of paper? Or does there have to be something fundamentally space-like that is presupposed by the fact of comparison and interactivity at all?
Yeah, that touches on something I was thinking about getting into in this talk, but not sure about. But basically, space as prepositional, right? You know, is space a substance, or is space, you know, this prepositional affordance of types of relationships? And I think, yeah, we can play with both. I think both of them usefully, and maybe we just need to actually talk about different types of space or different levels at which we're discussing space. But for, you know, TSK, which, you know, I'm familiar with most, while it entertains the idea that, you know, we can deconstruct the idea of space in different ways philosophically, or we can show how it seems to be the outcome of this kind of pattern of thinking. Ultimately, it doesn't find it useful to get rid of the concept of space. And so rather than talking about spacelessness as the ultimate, it talks about great space as maybe, you know, the space that we can't get away from. Right.
I agree, which is to say, I find it indispensable to keep space in play as a fundamental axiomatic condition of thought. And partly that's my sympathy for the philosophical tradition of our species. Partly that's examination of my own mind and how I need, at the very least, the metaphorical presence of space in order to do any kind of thinking, and my appreciation for the limit conditions that it brings, rather than thinking we can just think it away when we might examine that thought and find that that isn't what we thought in that thought, so to speak. And yet it's extremely useful to throw out the conventional heaviness of space in order to activate more advanced functions in ourselves. But I don't want to get rid of it. I think the idea of different spaces for different states or state domains pretty much covers the variations. Mm-hmm. So that interaction potential, we could just say that is causal space.
Exactly. That's prepositional space, is causal space. Yeah.
So that we have these different sets of space that correspond to the fundamental categories in something like an integrative meta theory model. And we can simply use that and see whether that actually accommodates most of the different ways that people are using these terms.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me too. That's pretty much where I sit with this. And if I'm trying to interface TSK with integral theory, or, you know, maybe yoga philosophy and other things, you know, I see the volumetric as the gross. I see TSK's second level space as pretty close to what we might mean by subtle space, and then great space as analogous to causal or prepositional space. So I think, yeah, we've covered, a good range of things here. There was one little anecdote I wanted to play with just to toss it in.
Sure.
In terms of the usefulness of playing with space, and you're talking about like how when people who are large can inhabit their their fullness in a way that's actually very satisfying. When you feel and you meet large people who are okay with being very large, there's something really vital and joyous almost in being with them and around them. But yeah, I was thinking about different experiments I did when I was young of imagining my body as 10 feet tall or 15 feet tall, and I would walk down the street and inhabit that much larger body, and just the shifts that it can make psychologically in the individual. And actually, I noticed interpersonally, it had effects. When I was inhabiting that space, people navigated the space around me differently. I'm not saying necessarily psychically they picked it up, but maybe through body language or something else, I felt interpersonal interactions change. And so this little piece here is out of place in the overall flow of our discussion. It's something I wanted to say earlier, but I didn't want to leave it hanging.
I think it's interesting, and immediately makes me think of breath as one of our fundamental experiences of an expansion within ourself or a contraction. And then we know that there's these two kinds of difficulties where a person either doesn't open their lungs enough, or they're puffed up all the time and they're artificially and rigidly expanded, throwing themselves around.
Yeah.
There's two fixations of something that should be a natural fluid pulsation in spaciousness.
Right.
And then the other thing that I kind of want to touch on, in terms of proximity and adjacency as the model of space, the simplest way I think of it always for myself is, like, if you want to feel chi, if you have the capacity or the training to tune into those sensations, you don't really feel it here because you're touching each other, and you don't feel it when they're very far. You feel it when they're close.
Right.
And there's something about the ability to be close in all of this between people. When you expand and reach out, you're not just a center getting bigger. You're moving toward the others and the rest of everything.
Right.
And that's, I think, whether it's the entangled particles or two people or chi in the hands, or the very thing that the fight or flight mechanism tries to pull away from or drive off. All of that is the intensity of proximity, which we have to get physically, mentally, and emotionally better at accommodating in order to occupy our proper and full space in the context of all the other spaces.
Yeah, that's an expansion of Sloterdijk's interfaciality as a, the generative context that we can establish between ourselves and multiple things, not just our caregiver spaces. Pick some part of your body and be aware of sensations and feelings in that part of your body. Just be aware of the sensations and feelings. Let the breath be gentle and relaxed. and take a tour of the body, starting from wherever you are. Be aware of different parts, different sensations, interconnections. And be aware of how these different parts occupy space. Imagine that you are a tiny speck of awareness and travel around the body, being aware of what's there, different sensations, different feelings, different senses of space. Or possibly sensations of pain or tension or numbness. Maybe there's a sense that energy is blocked somewhere or obstructed somehow. Just keep traveling around, exploring, feeling what's going on. Allow yourself to travel over the surface of your body, skimming just above the skin. And then dive back in. If you feel any dense spots, you can try opening those up in different ways. You could simply breathe into those more obstructed spaces. Or you can imagine that those areas expand a little bit. If they expand, perhaps that density or obstruction can open up. Or maybe it doesn't. Whatever happens is fine. You can try slowly zooming in and zooming out several times and see what happens. You can let dense or obstructed areas expand and condense again and again, with the movement going at its own rate. You can just explore and see what happens at any level. Let yourself explore your body at different scales. The general inner structure, or internal organs, veins, tissues, fluids, or cells, molecules, bacteria. Or particular atoms, shimmering particles. Touch the vast spaces within each whirring atom. And let the breath be very relaxed, free, and spacious. Awareness is open to whatever is happening. Let awareness be drawn to wherever it goes, whatever energies or feeling it is drawn to, whatever levels or parts of the body. If awareness finds any dense spots, you can open them, letting them expand, exploring the different feelings in what might be a larger space. Continue exploring until all the surfaces and structures become completely open. The surfaces are no longer obstacles to awareness. The precision of the surfaces remains, but now as shining outlines, translucent boundaries, rainbow borders. Now let awareness be drawn to the edges of the body, where the body meets the space outside. Explore the edges and the boundaries. See how space outside is related to space inside. Is there any difference in the quality of the space outside and the space inside? Allow awareness to be drawn to different surfaces and different boundaries. Exploring the space inside, outside, and even within boundaries. Now return your attention to the presence of space outside the body and breathe in the essence of that space. The pure openness of that space. Very relaxed breathing, gentle. Through both nose and mouth. Allowing the essential openness to open up the body. Breathing in this space, the essential openness, allowing it to pervade every level of physical and mental organization. Allow it to pervade the organization and open it up until it's completely open and translucent, itself having the quality of space. Breathing in the essential open quality of space, allowing it to open up any densities or pains, rigidities, anything that seems fixed in any way, either within the body or the mind. Or within a bystander, like a sense of self or an observer. And during the exhalation, let the breath merge with the space outside, so that the interaction, the interpenetration between the inside and outside is unobstructed, free, transparent. Also let the space enter and pervade thoughts, feelings, perceptions, images, memories. And the sense of time that might be passing. So there's a complete commingling of space, inside and outside, in and out. Now open your eyes and take in the room. Notice the space around you, between you and other objects. As we sit or walk around with eyes open, we can be aware of positions, forms, and surfaces. See them also as space. Is it possible that all positions, forms, and surfaces might also be space and might be felt as very open, as somehow transparent, without fixed boundaries or inaccessible insides? By relaxing any ordinary sense of bystander that might show up as mind, self, or observer, as the witness, by relaxing those bystanders, knowing can be freed up to appreciate whatever is present without seeing it as other. Now allow your awareness to expand outward, encompassing the room, the house or building you're in, the city, the state or province, the continent, the planet with its moon, the solar system. The vast space of our galaxy. The enormous expanse of our local galactic group. Out to the farthest reaches of the universe, spanning trillions of galaxies, each with 100 billion stars. Space is flowering in countless forms, a serene explosion. Space projecting space into space, unobstructed, allowing an infinite play of form. Then slowly close in your focus. Withdrawing from the vast reaches. And returning to the room. To your body in its normal opacity, its normal solidity and weight. Might your body, in its normal density, also be the dance of space? Deeper than space is distance. Underneath the appearance of vastness and separation, of object and container, is there also a space that unites? What makes up the distance that we normally perceive? Is it fixed? Does it always feel the same? Or does this feeling of distance change? Awareness can explore the space in which subject, object, and distance appear. Bring to mind the image of a luminous flower in the desert night, glowing with its own subtle light. Might there be a sense in which the subject or the bystander is like a glow of an object, inseparable from the object, without any sense of ordinary distance? Where space might be said to unite subject and object? Might there actually be a field of space from which subject and object tend to polarize and emerge as separate and distant? A polarization that never leads to complete independence. Can you taste the space of no distance?